package, there's a bio about me. Just quick what I've done. I've spent a long time with Westinghouse Electric. I had run their China joint ventures for power generation. I ran the Westinghouse power generation service business based here in Orlando before it was acquired by Siemens. I ran their international service companies in Arabia, Singapore, Australia, Thailand, other key markets around the world. I left there when Siemens bought the company to consult for a few years and then found the Mitsubishi Power Systems power generation business for the Western Hemisphere and put that here in Orlando. So I was proud to be very involved with the economic development in Florida from that perspective. And while I was doing that and became president of the company, I also served on the board of Enterprise Florida. So very involved over time with caring about and pushing economic development in Florida. So I'd like to pull together the nexus of start global energy activity, especially as it involves electrification and electricity, bring that down to the country, and then more to Florida, case in point, as to how that affects what you all do in terms of commercial real estate development generally, be it commercial or residential, and how critical economic development is and how critical energy supply is to fueling the economy and making sure the economy is going and moving forward in a progressive way to create opportunity for your industry. What some of the threats are being posed by the lack of, my talk is talking about Florida energy policy. There really is no state energy policy. Energy policy is delegated to the states across the US, but the way that works, states generally don't have energy departments, such as the country has the DOE. States have state houses, they've got governors, they've got state senates, and they've got public service commissions that stand in the position of approving electricity rates, but not dealing with energy policy. It turns out the key large cap utilities in most states really do direct energy policy and do most of the directing to state houses, state senates, and the governor of what that policy should be. So there really is a lack of thoughtful at the state level, what is energy policy activity. So that's like these things like talk about. Here's something, students never do this in your presentations, is have a slide without a banner or title on it. This slide has no title. What this is about just, let's talk globally. This is a correlation of electricity consumption per capita to GDP per capita by country. And you can see an inarguable correlation between human electricity consumption and GDP, or economic vitality, measured per person, if you will. If you look at the lower quadrant, where the locus of most countries in the world, and for example, the 11 or 12 sub-Saharan African nations are, the relativity of electricity consumption per person to the US, for example, is that of from 1910 to 1915 per person. That's where power generation, and therefore electrical use, in those countries resides today. And they're, dominate the many, many dots in the lower left quadrant. Of course, the upper right quadrant are Western Europe, the United States, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia out there with massive supply of energy, which is a very good thing for a fewness of people on a relative basis. But mainly the upper right quadrant are the Western European nations, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Moving in something of a different direction. We'll talk about that. So if you look at, geopolitically, what's going on in the world, things like we've got this devastation of 800 million people living in sub-Saharan Africa with electricity consumption at a 1910, 1912 US equivalent level. And there are agencies that support economic development there, the World Bank, the European Development Bank, the equivalent to Exim Bank in the US and Japan and Europe, and the Chinese Development Bank. United States Exim and the World Bank have stopped funding conventional power generation systems for sub-Saharan Africa. They will only fund renewable systems that supply energy, if sun, 5 hours a day, if wind, 7 hours a day, not 24, at costs of 4 to 5 to 10 times what conventional power sources are. China, on the other hand, in the economic development being supported by their Economic Development Bank, will build, and half of what they do in energy space, coal plants, gas plants, and things that matter for large density, large use energy supply to begin to elevate the welfare of folks living in those countries and bring them more into a 20th century kind of economic vitality. So, we're already kind of missing the mark on having geopolitical influence in the way we behave vis-a-vis the World Bank and the Exim Bank, specifically now no longer supporting development in those kinds of countries with conventional, large density, high impact power generation systems. So moving along, looking at how does this look across the world in terms of where we are and how the United States has emerged up to now. This chart is about basically retail electricity cost per wallet share. If you take retail rates for power compared to what people make in take-home pay after taxes by country. You can see the lower left, of course, Kingdom Saudi Arabia, massive advantage. Next, though, I've calibrated to a 1 on this chart. This is a relativity chart. So 1 is the United States in relative to the cost per wallet share of electricity compared to other nations. If you begin to move up the right quadrant, okay, what do we see? We see Sweden and Australia at 2.5 times the cost per wallet share of electricity as in the United States. Then we look at the UK, Spain, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Denmark, 3 to 4.5 times the nominal cost of electricity to their citizens as we've had typically in the United States. This is 2021 data. This is before the crisis in Europe. The data now on the differential is much worse. Those aforementioned Western European countries, you're looking now at 4.5 to 6.5 times the relative cost of electricity to their citizens is here and to their industry, So over time, what's happened, like with Germany, you've got economic devastation has resulted in the UK, now more increasingly evident in Germany, in Spain, from this kind of cost burden imposed on their citizens and on their industry. So what's happened over time? Germany, you've seen BASF over time, Mercedes, BMW, move large facilities to western South Carolina, Spartanburg, Greenville, where you've got, historically you had electricity costs 8-9 cents. That's not the only reason they've gone there, by far and away. Labor cost also, major advantage to Germany. Access to this market, of course, a key driver. But electricity cost is now pushing their very large chemical industry, the balance of their electric car and traditional gas-powered car industry out of Germany and into the global south, where they can afford to run companies that manufacture things. And energy cost is a huge ingredient of the why that's happening. When you're looking at electric power cost in Germany being now 5 to 6 times what it is here. And I'm going to propose to you most of that is based on a self-inflicted set of policies that has caused that. But these countries that I've highlighted with a red dot, those in the 2.5 to 5 times more cost per person than here, have in common the absorption of about 25% more renewable power in their power portfolio than the United States has at this point in time. The challenge, China's not on the list, by the way. China doesn't supply data, all due respect to their amaze and wonderment at being the world's leader in solar and wind. They are in manufacturing products, not in using them. They don't support data supplying wages to the OECD, so we don't have their data on the chart. It's not available because the wage component is necessary. But the over-adoption of renewables before we have a fungible way to have them cover a 24-hour day is the problem with why these countries have energy costs so high compared to here, and because of their over-absorption of those kinds of resources and because of their too early cessation of 100% of the time operating electrical plants. Just a quick primer on that, the stuff that causes the lights to be on and the room to be cool and this mic to be working has to be running all of the time to create electrical load. Electricity must be created every nanosecond. Power generation sources like coal, nuclear, natural gas run all of the time. They provide, if you will, self-storage in our new vernacular. So they have self-storage because they run all of the time. And they run based on human command. The control room operator hits a button, you've got electricity. Nature-based resources that used to be called unreliable by our United States Energy Information Agency under the DOE are now called variable resources, do not run based on human command, run based on the vicissitudes of nature. Solar power in the United States averages about 4.8 hours a day. In Florida, it averages usability about 5.2 hours. Actually, not much more, because you all know in the summer months, July, August, September, often by half the days, by 1:30, it's pretty dark with a heavy cloud cover. Solar power goes away when that happens. But more to the point, it doesn't work at all for electricity generation after 4:30 and before about 9 in the morning. Zero, nada, in this state and in most states. So this is the nub of the issue. So we move along, okay, how, in this country, if you look at state by state dynamics, I've listed here on the left side the highest cost electricity states compared to the 10 lowest on the right side. In retail electrical rates in 2022 data, about a year and a half ago, where the state stood, the 10 most expensive averaged 23.5 cents a kilowatt hour for their citizens. This is retail, not industrial commercial. The cheapest 10 states, 10.5 cents. Striking differential has emerged. What do these states have in common on the left-hand side? On the left-hand side, California leading the way, you have a net importer situation of 16% of the electricity in these states is imported, meaning they've disowned making electricity because policies over time have deemed that to be a dirty activity. So they've pushed it out. California most notoriously. California only provides internally about 70% of its own electricity, with power plants left in the state. California is a net importer of about 34% of its electrical capacity. It imports from Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington. To wit the cost. The other dynamic, you got 6 states here that are in New England. The New England power pool over time has taken decisions based on then environmental considerations of the Sierra Club to shut down the main Yankee nuclear plant. Another nuclear plant, the Indian Point nuclear plant in New York, which supplied Rhode Island and Connecticut, substantial, continuous duty, 24-hour a day, massive quantities of electricity. The Vermont Yankee plant closed up there. And a set of policies that are completely opposed to the distribution of natural gas. New England has a very limited pipeline infrastructure because governments in New England over time have railed on against the uncleanliness and the concerns with pipeline natural gas. You've got a massive constraint of natural gas coming into New England, even though Pennsylvania nearby has some of the largest gas fields in the world. New England doesn't enjoy the use of it. To the extent they do, LNG is imported into Boston Harbor. LNG is 2.5 times more costly. It's about a $5, so now it's about a 8 times more costly thing than pipeline natural gas. So New England enjoys the highest natural gas costs in the country. Henry Hub now across the country is about $1.80 a decatherm. New England is on the order of about $9 a decatherm because of the constraint of pipelines. Therefore, New England, oh, by the way, despite all the efforts because of reducing nuclear power, shutting down coal plants, most of the New England states are now 90% dependent on natural gas for home heating, always, and for electricity generation. Therefore, the costs there are very, very high. So you look at this, you know, the other issue, the absorption of renewables by these states, the lowest 10 cost states have a far, far lower absorption of renewable power than the 10 highest cost states, who have a far higher absorption of self-constructed renewable power. We'll get into this in a few minutes. This is because if you want continuous electricity, that which operates all the time, and up to this point we do, you need to have also a system that runs all the time, on top of which you build your renewable system as more of a, yes, we're doing that too. When you add both together, you've got very, very high costs. because the CapEx cost of erecting that is passed along to ratepayers. So that's kind of heavily in the mix of why this is. Let's talk a little bit about the cost of these energy supply alternatives. What are first in the land use case, and this bears upon, what do many of you all do here, and what do you do in looking out there for fungible land to develop for commercial real estate projects of size and land acquisition of size. Here's a little summary of land use case by electric power generation resource. This is becoming increasingly important. It didn't used to be important because this used to not matter. Didn't matter when we built nuclear power plants. 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant takes about 640 acres. 1,000 megawatt, very large combined cycle plant. Of the type that Florida Power and Light just built 6 advanced, super advanced, world-class advanced combined cycle plants in Florida. At West County Energy Center, the company built the largest combined cycle plant in the Western Hemisphere, West County, just west of Juneau Beach. 6 other plants, 1,000 megawatts, about 60 acres on average. The consumption of land, the land use case for that kind of power plant. For example, the one in West Palm Beach, the power plant there, built by Siemens actually. About a 2,200 megawatt power plant in the city of West Palm Beach, in the northern part of the city, on about 12 acres. Provides power for 1 million people. Important factor though, all day and all night long. All day and all night long, just as an example. So you've got, if you look now at solar on the bottom, the capacity of a solar farm that would be in theory 1,000 megawatts, but there really is no such thing because that's in 5-hour-a-day increments. You've got to add up about 4 times more time to get to 1,000 megawatts, 30,200 acres of land. 30,200 acres of land. Just be aware. Now, as we progress into building more and more and more of this kind of capacity, fungible land left for agricultural development and real estate development goes away, because we're talking about huge quantities of land. Wind is a worst case, but there is the fact of the ability to use land under wind turbines for farming. Not much else. You can't really live under them because of the noise issue. Animals, humans have significant problems living under them. Farming you can do. So it's not quite the same thing, but if you look at the capacity of a 7.5-hour-a-day capacity wind farm, that's all the time that produces electricity, intermittently, 230,000 acres to yield 1,000 megawatts of continuous wind. But you have to remember, there is no such thing as continuous wind or solar. It's intermittent, it's jagged, it comes and goes, and it varies in its intensity. Wind by about 76% from one day to the next on the amount of it for the generation of electricity. Solar is about the same. But this data on the land use comes from, I was involved in building the West County Energy Center for Florida Power and Light, the 60 acres per 1,000 megawatts. That's about what that takes. The other, the 30,200 acres per 1,000 megawatts of solar, comes from FPL and Duke Energy announced data on the large number of solar farms you're seeing them build. This chat isn't about rooftop. This is about the big S, the big solar, is the utility scale farms you're seeing pop up all along I-75, the Turnpike, in some cases I-4, I-95, these 620 acre, 74.5 megawatt part-time wind farms. Already, we're talking about, we've got probably 70 of these built. We'll talk more in depth about those in just a few minutes. Huge, huge land use issue. And it's going to grow intensely in the next 10 to 20 years. This is a picture of 2020 data per day in the US, and so it doesn't matter what year it is. This was the installed base of, at that time, about 90,000 wind turbines in the US, 92,000 of them in 2020. What the daily power generation profile from those looks like. One day to the next, one day to the next, one day to the next. If you look at this, you cannot make this the foundation of an energy supply system. because you can't rely on that which varies and oscillates 76% per day, one day to the next. And this isn't one turbine at a time. This is the national data for wind power and what this resource looks like. And I'm not arguing that this is a bad thing, but I'm going to argue that the proliferation of it too extensively is a very dangerous thing and a very difficult thing, because of all that white space where you have nothing. You don't have electricity. Therefore, oh, dirty little secret, guess what? You better have a lot of gas turbines running in the background if you want the lights on all the time. Because, for example, storage today, we talk about storage, battery storage for major electrical generation for cities, counties, states, places like Orlando. Only about 2%, 1.8 to 2% of electrical power generation of this type, wind and solar, is actually backed up by batteries. And that is, the 2% that is, the batteries last, they discharge in 2 to 4 hours, period. So that's not very meaningful, because the cost of that is just off the charts. Secondly, the battery capacity in the world, lithium-ion batteries, is being directed to the more profitable arena of EVs. So the short supply of lithium, cobalt, and copper in the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in China, and the processing of those things that happen in China, is more segmented to car batteries, not utility scale storage. But anyhow, if you look at this is why when wind power is assigned, there's something called an ELCC, an electrical load carrying capability factor, that goes into an equation of how much power you generate, to have a system work. Wind power is accorded about a 16 to 17% ELCC, meaning if your life depends on electricity the next second, the next minute, you're having heart surgery, you're going into the fridge to get refrigerated, not spoiled food, you need air conditioning because it happens to be 97 degrees out, not because of extreme weather, because some days it is here, quite a few days. The absolute quotient of complete reliability in this resource is about 16%, because of this profile, that that's going to be there. So the variability in this is a huge issue. Again, 77% daily variation, and why, for example, the Texas grid has become notorious for being such a problem. This, by the way, this whole set of messages, this is not a political one. It's not a political message. The proliferation of this kind of energy resource is very much a bipartisan thing now, very much bipartisan. This isn't about I'm a conservative Republican or I'm a liberal Democrat and therefore I'm pushing one side or the other of this. I'm telling you this is now a more universally endorsed thing, that we ought to be applying these kinds of resources in mass, not to save the planet, to abate CO2. This has become a universally accepted thing. Texas, to point, enormous reliability issues because about 37% of Texas electricity supply is now wind and about 8% of it is solar. The problem with that is this. You've got, and the electrical system is tested always on the hottest days and the coldest days because that's when you need the most load. That's when you need the most electricity. The coldest days, Texas experienced 3 years ago in the Snowmageddon, very cold time period for about a week and a half where massive brownouts reigned in the state. The temperature was so low that the wind power was gone. The blades freeze up. The capacity of wind gets very low. Actually, even some gas plants were damaged by extreme cold in that 10-day period. You had a massive power shortage, and we have continuously now power shortages being warned, sustainability or reliability notices being put out by ERCOT fairly regularly now in the heat of the summer, along with the coldest days of the winter, that you better turn the thermostat up at home, you better maybe turn the fridge off for a few hours, because ERCOT's the generation region of Texas, may not have enough electrons in the system any longer to support your life. And that's a new thing in the United States. That's a new thing in the last few years in California. That's a new thing in Texas. It's a new thing in California because, again, California imports 37% of its power. Texas has become dependent 37% on wind. And that's been run by one political party. It's not Democrat Party. This is where they put themselves. It's a huge, huge problem for industrial development in Texas, for any population growth in Texas, and actually for sustaining the folks that live there now. Let's shift over to that dynamic of that jagged picture, different picture of the, this is from the NREL, the National Electrical Reliability Association that supports the study of renewables. This is a map of the US for the concentration of the solar resource for power generation. If you look at the darkest areas, which are eastern Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, western Southwest Texas, up into Southern Nevada, the darkest areas are solar works about 7.5 hours a day. That's the highest concentration of solar in our 48 contiguous states for electric power generation. And this has all been mapped out for years, where the sun shines enough to generate electricity on a meaningful basis. And it is meaningful there because you got, a given year is 8,750 power generation hours. In those aforementioned states, you've got about 1,700 to 1,800 hours of usable solar for electricity. All the rest of the time is still missing, but you've got that. But that's fairly reliable because across about 310 days a year in those places, you know you've got sunshine. So move the case over here to where we are. We're in about a Florida generally, especially Central Florida, we're in about a 5.2 hour a day on this chart, solar availability on average. That's an average day. That's not every day, that's the average day. Inside of that, you get this amplitude of a lot of oscillation one day to the next, especially midway through June to midway through October, when we get the instability showers and the high cloud cover, dense cloud cover in the afternoon. A lot of oscillation. We're in about a 1,200 hour a year zone for enough solar power to make electricity out of the 8,750 hour year, about 1,200 hours. Meaning about here, about 5.2 hours a day. Up in the Northeast, you go Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, Ohio, West Virginia, Northern Virginia, you're at about a 4.6 hour, 4.5 hour day, 4.2 hour day because of their northern latitude. The huge problem with applying these kinds of resources up there is the fact of the time of day that they actually produce electricity, independent of the wonderful badging of doing something to save the planet, is a disaster financially. Because you're installing all this at the cost of billions of dollars and only picking up about 4.7 hours a day to 4.2 hours a day of very unpredictable electricity that you're grabbing time by time as the sun is there for you. As it's there, then when it's not there, you got to have something else. Right now, the something else is natural gas. It really is natural gas, is the case for that. So the problem becomes, in the Southwest, where the heavy concentration of solar power for generation exists heavily, subsidies aren't needed. In the Northeast and Upper Midwest, where it's a senseless case to be applying technology that only works 4 hours a day, subsidies shouldn't exist because we don't need, there's no fungible economic case to be doing this to begin with, accepting some notional idea of badging to be doing this. We talk also about there's a notional thing, that this stuff is free, that this kind of electricity is free. It's not free. Here's the life cycle cost of various kinds of generation resources, data pulled from the United States of America Energy Information Association under the DOE. Offshore wind, $456 a kilowatt hour. Onshore, half, about 222. That's with the battery storage. That's when I include the battery storage necessary to levelize that electrical capacity with combined cycle, coal, or nuclear, meaning all day long. That's a fair way to look at it. What does this really cost me if it's there for me all day long because I need electricity all day and all night? Utility scale solar, $219. Advanced combined cycle, large combined cycle plants that take gas, take the exhaust into a steam turbine, maximally efficient, $36 LCOE. Capital cost, offshore wind is 8 times more expensive than combined cycle electricity. Onshore wind about 7 times more. Solar about 5.5 times more costly per annual kilowatt hour generated. Not the rating plate that says here's the maximum capacity of these things, but here's a measure in terms of the continuous electricity supply when you look at the cost compared to that 5 to 6 times more costly the case of installing solar. This isn't rooftop, but utility scale solar power. So just to digress into that real quick, you look around the mantra on this. Here's an example of how this gets spun on the core cause. I'm not a scientist on this, but I am a reader of data. Here's our primary. If you go into Microsoft and read about the chemical constituency, this is digression into environmental, and the worries about CO2, which became a worry not until about 2012. 25 years before that, we had identified sulfur, nitrous oxide, heavy particulate mercury as true pollutants to be abated, things that harmed human health. About 25 years later, CO2 hit the radar screen as somehow harming human health. So here's how Microsoft characterizes, just for an example in this, the content of the upper atmosphere. True and correct. Nitrogen 78%, oxygen 21%. Again, chemical constituency of the upper atmosphere, what it consists of for Microsoft. Argon 0.9%. CO2 is on the list, 0.04% of the upper atmosphere. And then we have a footnote below, other gases in trace amounts such as water vapor, neon, and methane. Trace means too low to measure. Oh, by the way, 0.002% falls in the category of too low to 0.04, too low to measure. The case for water vapor varies from 2% to 4% of the upper atmosphere. 2% to 4%. Oh, it's not on the chart of the top 4. It's not there. It's in a footnote. It calls it a trace element. On the other hand, CO2 is in the list because it needs to be in the list because this is the narrative on this. But the reality is, it's 0.04% of the upper atmosphere. The man-caused portion of that is 5% of that. The naturally occurring portion of CO2 coming from decaying plant material, decaying animal material from particularly evaporating water, 70% of it is where CO2 emanates from. It's not an emission, it's a naturally occurring thing. 95% of it comes from those natural resource causes. 5% of it is man-caused. So we're into managing 5% of the 0.04% and the elevation in that. There are a broad number of scientists, it's only factual data, who support the contention that yes, there has been a small amount of warming in the last 150 years, but the man-caused reality of that is a tough putt to determine. It doesn't look like it's CO2 is the main driver. Water vapor is certainly a main driver. It's accepted by all scientists to be a 60% driver of warming. By the way, the Hungatonga volcano that happened 2 years ago in the South Pacific, undersea volcano, largest explosion on Earth in the last 140 years, will produce about a 10% elevation for 10 years in airborne water vapor up through the ionosphere. So going to have a minor impact on temperatures because water vapor drives, all scientists are on board with this, including Microsoft, by the way, that water vapor is the dominant cause of warming. Now, moving ahead. Okay, what's happening? A lot of these projects, we're hearing now more and more about the point to offshore wind. Offshore wind, remember my data point, this is true and correct. Dominion Energy, for example, we're building an offshore wind farm off of Newport News, advertised at 2,800 megawatts in size. The real net capacity of that, because it'll run only 42% of the time, is about 1,100 megawatts. That's a medium-sized power plant, equivalency. The cost of that, announced by Dominion Energy, $9.8 billion 2 years ago. They're now seeking new investors in project because it's not economically viable at that type of cost level. Again, 10 times the cost of conventional combined cycle electricity. I built 3 big power plants for Dominion Energy. They were about 1,400 megawatts each, combined cycle, 3 gas turbines, 3 steam turbines, big plants. The average cost of those were generate 1,600 megawatts all day long, about $1.7 billion. So you've got Dominion building 1,100 megawatts of power for $9.8 billion because it's offshore wind. Ratepayers will get those costs. Those costs will be handed to ratepayers. So now we have Ørsted, the Dutch supplier of wind farms, basically going bankrupt in the US. We have, because these projects that they're planning off New England and off New Jersey are non-viable projects, but mainly because the resource that they're mining doesn't operate 58% of the time. So when you take the cost of the electricity and compared to the kilowatt hours coming off that continuously, you've got a horrendous measure of value. So back to, okay, what are we doing here? NextEra announced, and we've got in the state of Florida, bring it home to the state of Florida. NextEra announced about August of 2022, its commitment to net to gross zero, meaning Florida, NextEra is going to install 90,000 megawatts of solar. So you know that means 1,200 square miles of solar farms across Florida, built by them. About 1,100 solar farms at 74.5 megawatts each, about 680 acres each, according to their data in what they've announced thus far. So they've announced that spend will be $115 billion over a 20-year period. The first 10 years, about $28 billion. They've also announced 50,000 megawatts of battery storage. The spend on that, EIA data and their own data, $43 billion. Going to convert a bunch of their gas resource to green hydrogen somehow at a cost of $5.2 billion. When you add all this up, the Florida Power & Light announced NextEra is the holding company that they've created to benefit from the market cap valuation of wind and solar resources. They're going to spend $300 billion on this in Florida. Their annual CapEx budget generation today, 2020 to 22, is about $1.6 billion a year, normal. With this, it'll be $15 billion a year, every year. Where does that go? That goes into electricity rates. That goes into electricity rates. They advertised, by the way, that they saved Florida ratepayers in 2022 $350 million on the conversion to already 6,000 megawatts of solar that they've installed. If you take the price of gas when they did that when they announced this plan, was about, they waited for the ultimate peak during the crisis of Ukraine for $9.30 decatherm natural gas. This is the price of natural gas in the US over 25 years. This is the moment in time FPL announces the solarization plan for Florida, because you can put this out there that, guess what? We're in cost neutrality for our ratepayers. The ratepayers will come out neutral on this. No, natural gas when they announced this was $9.50. Natural gas today is $1.80 a decatherm. So the payback that they were projecting on the solarization has now degraded to, at present gas prices, a 75-year payback for the ratepayers. If gas prices go back to where they were in 2023, the payback on their plan will be 25 years for ratepayers. But that's not to mention the fact that the base rate, which is 70% of the power bill, their administrative costs, their power plant costs, their line costs, the fixed cost of their operation, the investment part, the CapEx part, same as Duke, across the country, 70% of the power bill is that. They've raised that 29% in the last 3 years to begin to pay for incrementally this solarization plan. So when you remember those metrics for the European countries and the country Australia and New Zealand who have done this extensively, why energy costs are 3 to 4 to 5 times higher than here, this is the why. When you've got people talking about building an incremental system on top of the one we have already to make things somehow work out in net zero space, you're talking about all incremental cost. $300 billion a year, over that 20-year period, $15 billion, where typically per year, they're spending only $1.8 billion on new generation per year. So you're talking about 8 times more money on that, means rates will probably wind up being, at the end of this plan that they have, to install 90,000 megawatts of solar across Florida. Duke Energy, by the way, doing a similar thing. When you combine the two, you've got about 1,400 square miles of solar being planted. This is going to take land prices through the roof, fungible land for development costs through the roof, as you've got a guy now in the kitchen, a gorilla in the kitchen, with a 30% federal subsidy in their hip pocket to bring to landowners too, because this stuff is subsidized, to buy out massive quantities of land to build these farms on. You're talking here, again, between the 3 major utilities in the state, announced plans to do about 1,300 square miles of solar and battery storage. So finally, if you just go to the, okay, what does this mean to the country? This is not just happening here. I've done an exhaustive survey, and then I've taken some consensus, Booz Allen, Boston Consulting, McKinsey data on how they promote for their clients the story of the U.S. energy supply. The left-hand side, we've got 1,152 gigawatts of installed capacity of electrical equipment in power plants in the US today. Based on the fast transition to renewable power, yeah, look at the bar chart on the right, will grow to 1,695 megawatts of installed capacity. Now here's the problem. And then, of course, the big bars with the growing wind, 180 gigawatts, solar, 450 gigawatts, huge, looks great. When you factor those down, the numbers in black, that's my data. That's the net capacity of that stuff, the net capacity, because again, wind operates for generation 36% of the time, solar operates about 20% of the time. So when you look at that, in reality, the net basis of the power being produced by those resources is far lower than what you've got with conventional resources being shut down. We're shutting down about 130,000 megawatts of coal in that same time period. We're shutting down about 3,000 more megawatts of nuclear in that time period. The disaster of that is that stuff runs all of the time. It runs all the time. And we're replacing it with stuff that runs basically runs a few hours a day for stuff that had been running 24 hours a day. So the real issue with electricity production on a kilowatt hour basis of continuous supply is we're only growing that by about 5.5% across 10 years, where that should be growing about 15%. And that's before we talk about electric vehicles, just normal GDP growth, normal population growth. Electrification falls short using these technologies that operate very part-time by about 1,000 power plants worth. Growth should be 15% in electrification before EVs is about 5 in this scenario of the rapid transition to renewables as we shut down conventional power generation plants. A huge problem for Florida in cost base. Rates will advance if that happens, probably by a factor of 4 times here. Going to provide a lot of damage to industrial investment here, to commercial real estate investment here. You know, I had mentioned I was on the board of Enterprise Florida. The new chairman had told me even 9 months ago that we're having trouble now discussing nominal new investment here by steel plants, Nucor Steel, by car companies, by pulp and paper, by chemical, by more companies like Mosaic in phosphate, because the electrical load here is now increasingly deficient, because non-reliability here is growing and growing and growing, because we're introducing way too much part-time resource into the generation system. At the end of that process, by the way, for example, FPL's reliability will be, today is what they produce is 88% dispatchable, meaning a control room operator can hit a button, turn on power for the people and for industry. At the end of this 20-year trip, the dispatchable part, the man-caused electrical system part of what they produce will be about 18%. The part dependent on nature and what nature gives you will be 82% of their installed load. That puts the state into an enormous reliability challenge. So this is of moment to those of us worried about economic development in Florida. So that's, any questions about my message or comments or of interest to you? Yes, sir.
Got a microphone.
There actually, shockingly, there isn't. I'm going to tell you that both these companies, that our 2 biggest regulated utilities, are 2 of the dominant, effective, large-scale nuclear operators in the country. Florida Power and Light, 4 major nuclear plants in the country, 2 in Florida, Duke Energy, about 7, principally in the Carolinas. They're both big-time, major, effective, totally safe builders, owners, operators of nuclear power facilities. Neither company have in their plans 20 years out doing any of this in Florida, and they should be, There is a lot of happy talk going on about SMRs, small reactors being developed, and that's a good thing. Those are 200 to 300 megawatt small size reactors using thorium and a variety of other ways of getting a reaction from nuclear. That technology is still 12 to 15 years out. The cost basis of it turns out to be right now modeling as high as large-scale nuclear. So the technology that we do have developed, which is a conventional large-scale nuclear reactor, be it pressure water or boiling water reactor, one of the two that have been, it's been 20 to 25% of our electricity supply. Unfortunately, Duke Energy nor FPL are looking at for Florida. They should be. They should be. Because inside the envelope of a $300 million capex by FPL, you can easily erect 4,000 megawatts of new baseload continuous duty nuclear using present technology that they very successfully operate at places like Turkey Point for about $40 billion, $45 billion, 4,000 megawatts. Benefit of that, it runs all of the time. So it has, in present parlance, internalized storage because it runs all of the time. No, instead, we're going to spend $300 billion on stuff that very short life. Another problem with solar, 20-year life, not 50, 60-year life. So you wind up replacing it. Battery storage has a 10-year life. So as they happily invest $120 billion in that, knowing that that's only a 10-year life thingy, in 10 years, that's all going to need replaced with another $120 billion. Now, regulated utilities here happen to enjoy a guaranteed 10.8% guaranteed return on their CapEx investment. So then you go to maybe why do they like this? That has a lot to do with the motivation for it. But from an energy standpoint, yeah, nuclear is a great option. We're not pursuing it. We should be. So to the extent you can have some advocacy to talk to your state house, state senate, the governor, and the Public Service Commission about what we're not doing here, the absence of more nuclear power, it's an obvious choice we ought to be doing. Because you want to mix. You want to mix. You want some of this. Maybe 10 to 12% of the system. This is not a bad thing, renewables. But you want nuclear. You need some coal, which has been largely cleaned up. That's why China's installing so much of it. China's installing 2.5 times more coal than solar and wind right now. They're using ultra supercritical clean coal technology that was invented here and in Germany and Japan. Japan did just recently 13 gigawatts of 13 new coal plants. Completely clean, high temperature, ultra supercritical technology invented here, Germany, and in their country. So you need, what you need with energy is a mix of resources that tend to be domestic. Get entirely committed to resources coming from China in terms of solar, specifically inverters and batteries. It's very problematic, but more so on a cost basis. On a cost basis and reliability basis, just not a sustainable model. They themselves are not doing this. They themselves are not doing this. They remain very dependent on their coal and now growing gas availability from Iran, from Russia, pipeline gas into China, so they've solved that problem. We're accepting their mantra to buy their equipment. We are accepting their own mantra that we're somehow destroying the planet, so they're winning on that. They are not doing this. They are supplying the equipment at a massive economic advantage to them. So do they promote this as a necessary? Of course they do. Are they doing it themselves? Of course they're not. Of course they're not. They care about their people. This is why they do what they do. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just checking. What's the update on the shrinking of the Colorado River on the effects of the western states?
On the what?
The effects of the western, California, Arizona. I was out there last year river rafting, and actually when we landed, the water receded almost a mile from where it was before. So what's the update on the shrinking of the Colorado River as it affects the electricity production?
Well, it's going to, again, this has come and gone over history. The absolute level of the Colorado River and the Snake River. We are, in that part of the country, also enormously dependent on the hydroelectricity supplied by the Hoover Dam, which is affected by that. Hydro, is counted inside of our renewable numbers. It's been there for a long, long time. It does vary quite a bit. It generally is about a 60% reliable thing that varies between high seasons and low seasons by up to 50%, depending on the time of year specifically. Dry periods being low ebb for hydroelectric generation, wet periods being a high end, and snow melt season. So this is an impact of probably Hoover is 30,000 megawatts. We're probably talking, yeah, for the moment, probably 10 to 15,000 megawatt efficiency of river-based hydroelectric resource because of that. But recent rainfall is going to help ameliorate that to some degree over the next few months. So, you know, hydro again it's a wonderful thing, but it's variable. It has always been variable. Where it's very prominent, especially prominent in the state of Washington and Oregon, it's extremely variable because it's highly dependent on the snowpack and the snow melt and how much of that there is year to year, which oscillates year to year, not because of extreme weather, because the weather doesn't go in predictable patterns year to year. You have changes in snowfall. You have changes in rainfall. We dealt with a massive deficiency of rainfall between 1930 and 1937 in the country, causing the same phenomenon. We didn't have the Hoover Dam then, so it wasn't as noticeable. It didn't have the population out there that we do now. But yeah, presently it's an issue. Yeah. Yes. So, if there's one more, but significant impact on economic development in Florida. Yes, sir.
This isn't meant to be a polarizing question, but I'm just curious if wind and solar and battery don't make mathematical sense. I'm curious why FPL or the monopoly of FPL and Duke are spending millions of dollars on lobbyists to suppress and restrict the use of home solar.
Because they are the monopoly in their service territories. They are the monopoly and exclusive supplier of electric power generation. They view home solar as a competitor to their concession. It is a competitor to their concession. Before you had that, you didn't have any such notion of home-based electricity production. It is not in their economic interest to have, right now we have about 4,000 megawatts of installed rooftop solar. Well, at the end of 2030, we'll have significant 4,000 megawatts of installed rooftop in the state. Go figure why they don't like that. They're paying about 4 cents a kilowatt hour for that. They'd rather be the owner of it and embed at their 10.8% guaranteed rate of return solar farms on their side of the equation as the exclusive monopoly supplier. Therefore, they fight net metering. They fight it at every turn. And that's why they fight it. They want to be the sole owner of the concession of making electricity. When I was on the board of UCF, before that, I was running Mitsubishi Power Systems. UCF installed a 5.5 megawatt reciprocating engine to produce 20% of its own cogen electricity. Within 3 days of the plant going commercial, guess who showed up to offer to buy the plant from UCF? Bingo, Duke Energy. Why'd they show up? They viewed that as UCF robbing some of their load. Well, it's legal in this state to self-produce generation. On the other hand, because of the utilities and their control over regulations, it's not legal to sell that across the fence to your neighbor. Only they can do it, according to their regulations that they've promulgated and are now a fact of state law. They come to UCF, here, we'll buy this from you. 3 days after the plant went commercial. To my point, in their regulated monopoly regions, they want to be the sole supplier of that which they do. The money in this is huge. The 10.8% guaranteed return on them investing in more and more and more of this. It's mathematics, and it's good for their share position among those who like renewables on Wall Street. Yes, sir. Okay, thanks, guys. I guess there's one more.
Right?
Yeah.
Over some period of time, right? It's 20 years or whatever it is, right? It's going to
Yes.
take time for them to scale up, right? It doesn't happen overnight. But eventually, if you say today, this is what we're forecasting, not enough people are really talking about it from your perspective, I would assume, right?
Not enough.
But
not enough.
At a certain point, just because a monopoly has an incentive to keep doing it, right? Isn't there enough of an uproar from the people that also is starting to speak about the lack of resiliency? If we're actually having brownouts or things of that nature, right? Eventually, doesn't the tide shift over that amount of time where people demand a change, or do you think we're just set in this way?
Well, no, we desperately need that to happen. The uproar in Western Europe, where this has happened over a 20-year period, in California, where this has happened, in Texas, where this has happened, has been very, very slow. It's kind of like a silent cancer that moves forward, and really, by the time you're facing the 20 to 30 times more likelihood of momentary blackouts due to lack of energy supply that we will see within 10 years, according to FPL's own data, and then in 20 years, maybe 50 to 60 times more likelihood of momentary power interruptions because of lack of electricity. You'll have increasing awareness of it, but right now you have a media saying FPL and Duke's 29% rate increases in the last 2 years are because they're fossil fuel companies. Oh no, oh no. The cost of fossil fuels for power generation is down from $9.80 a decatherm to about $1.80 across the last 2 years. No, it's because they're embedding in the other part of their rate, the non-fuel recovery part, the massive cost of beginning this trip. And I'm telling you, the investment in this trip is huge. FPL alone, $300 billion of hard investment compared to what they would normally make in the same 20-year period would be about 2 times $2 billion, about $40 billion in the same time period. Rates will go through the roof. That's going to cause more of an issue, but it's very slow, and it takes a lot of, actually not a lot of deep thought, because this stuff is so intermittent and part-time, but it's not, the message needs to get some traction. It's going to be devastating to economic vitality in the state. Okay, thank you.